Hi, comrades. Good morning, good afternoon. Hello, welcome to the Tempest Forum on Which Way Forward for the Democratic Socialists of America, DSA. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Lee Wengraf, and I'm a member of DSA and the Tempest Collective based in New York City, in Queens. I'm also a member of Internationalism from Below, and thrilled to have everybody here. We've got a couple great speakers, and we're going to have lots of time for discussion. So just to kind of kick it off, I think most people here are aware that the DSA convention is coming up just around the corner, and I think as we in the lead up to this, I think there's a lot of questions for both DSA members and the left in general that are looming very large right now in terms of the level of crisis in our society, whether it's the impending climate crisis, vaccine apartheid, the levels of repression and police violence that are continuing unabated, or just overall the kind of profit-driven pandemic recovery, that it feels like the world we live in is as unstable and volatile as ever. And so for all of us here as members and comrades of DSA, by far the largest socialist organization in the US with close to about 100,000 members, we're invested, to say the least, in the strategic vision and campaigns and organizing approaches for advancing for such a critical vehicle of struggle, for working class struggle, social justice campaigns, international solidarity, and so on. And so I think looking ahead to the National Convention, which kicks off on August 1st, but obviously is going to have reverberations for the months and years to come, it's going to bring a lot of critical questions to the forefront and hopefully to the floor itself around a number of questions that we'd like to get to today: democratic and organizational structure, accountable structures, building struggle from below, our posture to the Democrats and independent workers organization and parties, and building and solidarizing with international struggles, and so on. So this is not obviously a complete list, and we'd really like to be able to pull apart and get into some of these questions today. And so just to frame this discussion, we have two really fantastic speakers who have spent a number of years organizing both within and beyond and alongside of DSA, and Andy Sernatinger and Promise Lee. So I'm going to introduce them both first, and then they are going to kick off the discussion, speaking 15 minutes apiece, and then we'll open up the floor for comments from the rest of all y'all. So Andy is a labor activist and member of DSA in Madison, Wisconsin, and he's also a member of the Tempest Collective and has written for New Politics, International Viewpoint, and Jacobin. So welcome, Andy. And Promise Lee is an at-large member of DSA and Solidarity, and he works on international solidarity programming with dissident movements in Hong Kong and China with the Lausanne Collective, and is also grassroots tenant organizer at Los Angeles Chinatown with Chinatown Community for Equitable Development, CCED. Welcome, Promise. And just a couple of logistics. First of all, so we are going to be recording this event. However, the Facebook live stream will end after the presentation. So if you'd like to join us for the discussion, please join us on the Zoom link, and I will drop that link into the chat. And then we will open up for discussion, and I'll give a little bit more info about that in a minute. So I'm going to throw it over to Andy to start, and then we'll go to Promise. And like I said, they'll both speak about 15 minutes each. So welcome, and Andy, please take it away.
Yeah, thank you. This talk was booked as Which Way Forward for DSA. And rather than talk about like the very specific things happening at the DSA convention and resolutions and all that stuff, I've done that a few times. This talk is kind of going to be more about the general political vision and the moment that we find ourselves in. So I think I would start really by saying that I'm not going to present one singular correct vision that everybody has to follow. Like I've come up with like the sectarian answer that everybody has to follow. I think really more what I want to do is talk about where we are and the challenges that we're going to be facing and really problem pose, but at the same time suggest that like while I don't think that I can say what the answer is. I certainly have plenty of opinions and positions and stuff that I'm not going to shy away from. So the first thing I think we really want to deal with is that we're in a very different political moment in 2021 than we were when DSA really got itself kicked off again in 2016. So DSA was sort of nobody's guess about where the left would find itself. If you would have asked them 10 years ago, nobody would have said, I don't think the new left, socialist left, is going to emerge through an organization called that's amazing. Sorry, the pickles got me confused there. Can you like kick that person or whatever?
Could everybody please mute?
All right, we good?
Sorry, everybody.
All right, that was fun. I haven't been pickle trolled before, so that's a new one for me. But all right, here we go. So I don't think anybody really would have guessed that that DSA was going to be the organizational vehicle for the new left, especially the socialist left a decade ago, but that is where we found ourselves. And I think conjuncturally, two things happened to make that the case. One of them was obviously the Bernie Sanders campaign in some regard, and the other one would have been the election of Donald Trump. And the two of those things together made this very peculiar set of circumstances where DSA grew very rapidly. And it also created a set of conditions for a socialist organization to grow in a way that actually hadn't been possible in, you know, at least two generations, right? So DSA became large very quickly. And I think that a lot of the political things that a socialist organization might have to deal with were sort of deferred or not necessary to confront, at least in the beginning, because there was a pretty strong external regulation. Stuff was happening, and there was a common purpose, right? So for a lot of people, that was the sense that there was a new political opening with Bernie Sanders, and also the need to confront the emerging far right through Trump. And that gave itself its own kind of unity, right? Like we didn't have to define what that would be so much. It was generally understood. I don't think that what was significant about DSA was its politics. Like, I don't think that something new and exciting really happened in its political vision so much. The major thing that DSA presented that was very significant was that for the first time in generations, you have a socialist organization that's able to unite a lot of socialists under the same banner, right? A lot of us, I think, are used to different movements that kind of interact with each other and they exist in an ecosystem, but they're not organizationally united. So different things become possible when you're in the same organization and you start to think about what you're doing in a common framework. But I would argue that this is kind of over now, right? That I don't think I'd call it a honeymoon, but that period of history where we had a lot of external regulation ended very suddenly in 2021. It was already starting to end in 2020, but you know, both of those two major national factors, Trump and Sanders, are both gone now. And that means that that external regulation isn't there, and DSA now has to set its own course politically. That's sort of the challenge that we're facing at this particular moment in history, right? And it's not just that we have two significant political things that are different. There's a lot of different things. You were in a moment where there was relatively higher degree of struggle. The Red State Rebellion was a major formative thing for early DSA. And capitalism was also fairly healthy. It was expanding, and now we're once again in a crisis period that's especially acute because of COVID. And I think that the state of the organization right now is everybody's pretty beat up over this last year. I don't think any organization like ours has ever had to operate entirely online before. And it made a lot of things that existed beforehand a lot harder to deal with, right? So those kind of mounted a bunch of challenges, and we find ourselves now kind of in a more of a defensive stance with a more of like a depression for capitalism, and that's changing what political issues we have to deal with. I think though that the thing is that this isn't something that is unique to DSA, right? We're not the first group of socialists in history that have dealt with it. Far from it, right? Is that circumstances change, and an organization has to be able to adapt to it, right? We don't exist for one moment and one moment only. If we're going to build a socialist movement that's vibrant, it can actually like challenge for hegemony, then we have to be able to roll with a lot of different things. The major challenge, I think, has been that because in the formative period of the last 4 years, so much was deferred, externally set for us, debates weren't had, is that we didn't actually build a whole lot of infrastructure internal to DSA, particularly when you think about us as a sort of multi-tendency organization. Managing political debates, differences of opinions, and actually trying to set a democratic course forward isn't really something that you had to do when everything seemed like it was kind of taking its own course automatically. And I'm giving a kind of general perspective of what I think DSA thought. It's not certainly what I thought. If you read anything that I had written about the time, is that I certainly supported the Sanders campaign, but warned that this could lead to a lot of demoralization and disorientation if we didn't adequately prepare for things that you could actually foresee. So what this leaves us at right now is that I think that we have to take some lessons from lapses of the past and try to reapply them a little bit in our own situation, right? We have to be very politically honest about the moment we're in. We're not winning. Like, I'm sorry if people feel like we definitely are, but I think if we're looking at the state of the world, there may have been a subjective feeling that we're advancing relative to where we were, like between 2016 to 2018. But in the overall scheme of things, if we look at like what is the organization of our class, the balance of forces, have we moved forward on the important demands that were put forward? I don't think that really has fundamentally changed things right now. So right now, DSA, I think, has to regroup itself and get over this sense of disorientation and start to acclimate to the fact that we're not in the same moment that we were. And time is going fast, so I'm going to have to just zip along. I think that part of that is that we can't, any of us, say that there is a singular, like we're winning and this is all we have to do, and then that will solve the problem. We have to have a little bit more of a pluralistic streak here and say that we have to do some experimentation. We don't know the way out of this particular moment. Well, we've been in similar moments like this before. It's most of what the left has been like for 40 years, and that there's no get rich quick scheme that we can take. But I think that we do have to make some priorities, which one of them is, if the significant thing about DSA is that it was able to unite a bunch of different socialists and create new potentials by having us together, right? One of those things is that we do have to try to preserve the unity that existed, right? It's not like we can say like we're going to cut the fat and like those guys suck and now we've solved our problem. That's not going to be a useful way for a socialist movement to move forward. Secondly, I think that we also have to understand that in moments like this, right, when everything's going well and you feel like you're on the advance, people can stand a lot of disagreement and frankly bullshit, right? Like, if somebody's an asshole, you can kind of handle it if you feel like you're moving forward. But now that we're in a period where things have kind of come to a stop and we're not sure what we're doing, there's often this tendency to blame one another, to try to look for who is the problem, adjacent to you, rather than see that this is a larger political issue that we're going to have to struggle through. And it's not going to be particularly productive to try and just solve that problem from the top and just say, like, we can create a single campaign and that's going to get rid of our whole problem. Some of these like tensions that exist in DSA right now that are like very, very sharp, I think people can definitely name out a few of them, but historically in the US, it tends to be the Democratic Party, the labor bureaucracy, and in international politics are three things that always have a very stark divide. And I think if we're valuing a multi-tendency socialist organization, we have to understand that we can't resolve those bureaucratically. We can't, as a singular organization, just say like, there's the correct situation and everybody else, here's the door. Like, we have to win those arguments politically, and history has to develop and help us figure out what we're doing. So I certainly have very strong opinions on all three of those things. But I think that we do have to have a little bit of flexibility. In terms of like, what are our strengths here, right? If we look at what DSA has that is useful, it's not that like we have an excellent body of theory or amazing politicians or anything like that. Like, what we have mostly is people. We have a whole lot of people. We have people that are willing to do things and want to do things. But the problem is that we can't squander that, right? Like that would be the real tragedy of this organization if we put all of this together and there's a lot of potential and all of a sudden we don't really try to do things that we could, right? That smaller groups couldn't. So for one, you have, I think there are two major demands that came up that don't know its way forward. So Medicare for all, very important. I think people all agree that this is, universal healthcare is something that we need in the United States, but does not have a strategic approach for how to move forward. I think that the DSA one, in terms of pressuring politicians, kind of played itself out, and people don't know strategically where to go with that. And so they tried to fold that into an electoral demand. And the same thing is largely true with the Green New Deal campaign. Again, very important campaigns, but no sense of strategic leverage or how to advance the goals. And so you end up seeing them go to try to do other major campaigns like the PRO-ACT campaign, which I hate. So like, if we also look at like something like the Democratic Socialist Labor Commission, this is like one of the most significant things that DSA actually has, because you have thousands of union members who, all have a similar framework as class conscious people that want to see a transformation of the United States. Are we using that as our leverage or not? I'm going to zip through the last couple because the pickle lady sort of messed me up on my timing. But one is...
I'll give you an extra minute just to compensate, but take one more minute, then wrap, please. Conrad.
Thanks. I think that our organization has to have a very strong democratic core to it if we're going to make it through any of these political issues. It's not that that's my singular prerogative that I just want things to be a certain way, but if you're going to be able to hold together an organization that has a lot of tensions and is trying to figure out its strategic perspective, it has to have the buy-in of the organization. And people can handle losing things if they make their case and they participate in a decision, but if it happens from the top, they just leave, right? That's what we see often. So last things here really is that I think that as a perspective from Tempest, say, mass conflict is going to happen, right? Like we're not going for a slow accumulation of ones and twos and trying to reform our way forward. Those are important struggles, but I think that we do have to have a sense, and DSA, I think, very much missed this last year, which is that mass conflict does happen. It's not something that you can always plan for, but for an organization with as many members as we have, we do have to start thinking about how it can implant itself to be able to be part of those things and incorporate that into our general perspective about how we're going to move forward. All right, I appreciate that. I felt like that was a little scattered, but I really look forward to the discussion and hope this is useful for everyone.
Thanks so much, Andy. That was great. We're going to now turn to Promise, who will also give about 15 minutes of comments, and then we'll open it up. So Promise, please go ahead.
Great, thanks Lee, and thanks Andy for the very helpful presentation. Thanks again for comrades at Tempest for this invitation to speak. And I'll spend my time discussing some thoughts on the prospects and challenges for international working class and mass movement solidarity in the DSA. As Andy has helpfully charted out in his primer for the upcoming convention and New Politics, which I encourage everyone here to read, there are 6 total resolutions on the table on international politics, one of the largest categories behind organizational and electoral issues. While this general focus on internationalism is correct, much of the rank and file work remains isolated from international struggles, and DSA as a whole lacks an effective strategy that can adequately understand how global capitalism and imperialism function and can uplift the forces and alliances that can best promote liberation for all. I'll begin with identifying what I see as the key problem. What replaced the social imperialist Second International aligned politics of the DSA old guard in organization's recent years of growth is what I call a soft campus consensus. This possession includes a broad array of actors, most often those who do not know the nuances of other countries' political conditions and rely on a soft apologia for these regimes, for so-called left-wing regimes, while commenting solely on the US side of this issue. This is an attractive model that can gather those uninitiated into international politics more effectively, while providing no real alternative to the structures of imperialism that often are not contained by national borders or geopolitical blocs. Their defenders, some associated with the collective power network and DSA cardinal milieus, excuse their support of repressive parties by identifying them as genuine mass organizations, as listed by the authors of Resolution 14 for the upcoming DSA convention, whose internal problems can be excused because of their mass base. Some of these authors recently condemned the genuine internationalist alternative of Resolution 17 promoted by some of the comrades here in the room, which correctly privileges mass movement solidarity and embodies a healthy skepticism towards state power and bureaucratic centralization, in keeping with the ethos of recent mass struggles from Puerto Rico and Hong Kong to France. But our detractors see this as chauvinistic, with a critique published this week accusing us of compelling the DSA to, I quote, denounce from a remote perch in the bosom of the imperialist core and any and all left-wing projects where material reality intervenes against their narrow ideological expectations. But what determines a party's mass nature? Without the capacity for independent democratic decision-making, mass participation can be channeled for undemocratic ends. The Chinese Communist Party, for example, boasts one of the largest party memberships in the world, while consistently demobilizing popular organizing and the right to protest, while standing at the helm of one of the world's largest capitalist power. This blanket support for organizations because of their mass character shuts down room for critique and discussion, legitimizing bureaucratic structures rather than amplifying the democratic minority or non-state elements that genuinely promote popular struggle and revolutionary power. As imperialism continues to afflict different communities unevenly, both within states themselves and between states and corporate entities, we must reserve the right as socialists to critically discern between the forces we relate to and uplift. And the reality is, some of the most important struggles in recent years cannot fit into facile paradigms. In fact, many come in reaction to what one might falsely see as the bastions of a geopolitical alternative to centuries of Western colonial rule in Syria and Hong Kong and etc. And the American left so far has no praxis to adequately account for these sites of struggle, beyond rehashing outmoded 20th century Cold War paradigms, not unlike the rhetoric of the State Department itself. to defend against repressive regimes against mass movement in the name of anti-imperialism. This has led to a blatant oversight of the reality of authoritarian capitalist exchanges of methods between nation states that completely demystifies these ideological fictions. China's growth, for example, is built on decades of super exploitation of its own working class for global North markets and murderous alliances with US imperialism, from aiding the massacre of Bengalis and Vietnamese in the 70s to building its police state in Xinjiang and Hong Kong by appropriating resources by the likes of David Petraeus, Eric Prince, the Israeli military, and even the US police force itself. And happy to share some more of proof for this stuff in the comments later. In Cuba, for example, hashtag Heroes de Azul campaign is a direct reference to the US hashtag Blue Lives Matter, as its policing of Afro-Cubans, especially with its rise of its capitalist sectors like tourism industry, parallels the rampant policing that accompanies the violence of gentrification in our communities here. When left-wing governments, quote unquote, appropriate and build on colonial structures of oppression, we must hold them accountable as well. Calling for the end of US imperialism should mean something beyond only selectively critiquing its vehicles and effects. Xinjiang scholar and socialist David Brophy once prudently noted that in the past, the USSR and its allies monopolized the discourse of peace, while the US and its allies did the same with the paradigms of freedom. We see a similarly reductive dynamic at play today. We're offered a false ultimatum of either anti-war work or imperialistic human rights advocacy, just as police from China and Venezuela to the US economically and politically constrain the rights of its people. At the heart of these issues is an age-old problem, a failure to understand and connect the intimate relationship between mass movement building and political democracy encapsulated in the praxis of genuine democratic socialism. And for failing to understand this, the international leadership of DSA has in fact never found an ideological alternative beyond appealing to various forms of status, social democratic bureaucratism in its transition in its last few years. What the recent DSA Venezuelan delegation showed us is how the Second International and these Sao Paulo forums and delegations are merely two sides of the same coin. What we need is a complete reimagination of how we conduct international solidarity on an organizational level that can move beyond the performative street actions, but alike of the Answer Coalition, or the bureaucratic exchanges conducted between the DSA and these so-called mass parties. I don't profess to invent a new solution for internationalism today. I don't need to. They're already beginning to occur on a grassroots level. But the issue at hand is, why is the DSA and the larger American left almost completely delinked from or dismissive of these efforts? What more can we do to support these efforts? Why are DSA members proudly live tweeting their stays at five-star hotels in Caracas, receiving more traction than perhaps the most coordinated American left effort to provide solidarity with Myanmar trade unionists against the military coup, which also includes the members of the DSAIC. What American socialists understand is that many of these pro-democracy or decentralized movements exist in regions in which ruling authoritarian left parties have sought to completely neutralize the traditions of democratic left alternative to movement building. In other words, the actually existing socialisms of the last century are dead ends, and the American left has consistently sabotaged its own capacity to discover new socialist paradigms with mass movements anew. While leftists scoff at the small sizes of dissident left groups like the Mayoría Socialista as idealistic and not worthy of support because of their distance from mass interest and a base, have we stopped to consider the overwhelming pressure these movements have faced by state socialists and government and US imperialists alike, who have both sought to erase their existence for their own political capital? Or what of the various factions and currents within diverse PSOL in Brazil? This is precisely where solidarity and discernment are needed, not the dismissal of the complexity of non-Western politics and actors in the name of anti-imperialism. We are in the position to share and empower oppressed peoples with their organizing experiences here, through organs like the DSAIC to your local chapter's labor commission, for example. This is not to determine the terrain or horizon of struggle for these people, but to do what we do as internationalists, to stand in solidarity with people oppressed by regimes, no matter the color of their flag, and allow them to discover the path of struggle on their own terms, to model a socialism for the 21st century together. More concretely, how can our international work as socialists factor in, for example, the role of logistics and supply chains in connecting systems of oppression, or indigenous advocacy against exploitation from the Amazons to the Tibetan water fields? This entails rethinking what counts as international solidarity activism, and rebuilding its connections with local and national work. This means more organic connections between the IC and various other branches of DSA work, and also simply providing space for political exchange sometimes between rank and file organizers that are not apologists for the oppression of others in their own regions. Earlier this year and in the last year, another collective that I'm part of, Lausanne Collective, brought together trade unionists from different sectors to learn from each other's experiences. In a recent webinar, a Hong Kong medical worker that we brought on, very much impressed an Oakland-based Black unionized hospital worker about the rapid growth of her union, despite understate repression and the height of the Hong Kong protests back home. Just as the latter introduced the former for the first time to Jane McAlevy's methods in that meeting, organizing methods in that meeting. Another exchange, cleaning worker organizers from the US, Hong Kong, Colombia, and Malaysia organically came together to propose developing a joint international cleaning workers' demands for regimes around the world. Trade unionists I've talked to from Southeast Asia have told me about the desire to learn from activists who have organized against the TTP as they now face the rise of the world's now largest free trade agreement in the form of RCEP. The possibilities are legion. The convention's Resolution 17 is the first step towards opening the door to grassroots mass movements that are pointing the way to the future of the democratic left, rather than so-called left-wing mass parties in Resolution 14, which are shibboleths of the past and oppressors of the present. Lastly, I encourage more good faith debates between comrades on both sides of this issue, and I call on my allies to model what working through ideas democratically and collectively in mass organizations look like for our distractors in this debate itself. It is time to reimagine what anti-imperialists and internationalist praxis can look like for both our comrades and our enemies outside. And I'll end there for now.
Thank you so much, Promise. That was fantastic. Thanks so much to both of you. So a couple things as we transition into the discussion portion. So again,